All right. All right, folks, so let's go ahead and begin. Good evening and welcome to our first lecture of the fall semester. So my name's Scott Newbold. I'm a member of the biology faculty here at the college, and we are grateful to the Sheridan College Museum of Discovery Science Lecture Series for bringing folks here that are both local and regional and sometimes across the country. Tonight we've got a quasi-local person. And just two notes I wanted to make before introducing tonight's speaker. One is, well, I guess just one note. I wanted to share the dates and the topics for the future lectures we've got coming up this semester. So October 18th is John Laughlin from the Natural Resources Program within WYDOT, and he's an archaeologist, and he's going to talk generally about archaeology in Wyoming. So his own personal experiences through time. October 18th, 7 p.m. in this room. And then December 6th, also a Wednesday night, 7 p.m., Bob McDowell, who's a local person that some of you know, and he's going to be talking a bit about climate change and geoengineering, some of the techniques that we're looking into for maybe delaying some of the effects that are coming. His title is Sheridan Oceanfront Property Coming Soon. How can geoengineering slow this potential reality? All right, so tonight I'm going to introduce Tim Thomas. He's the regional supervisor of wildlife, maybe with the Game and Fish here in the Sheridan office, to introduce a colleague that's come up from Casper tonight. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Jeff. So luckily, I am not your guest speaker tonight. My role is going to be very short here tonight, so I'm just introducing Heather. So Heather comes to us from Wisconsin. She got her bachelor's degree there in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she got her master's degree working on white-tailed deer ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Right after graduation, she came to Wyoming in 2005 and moved right to Gillette in the middle of the CBM boom, and got to deal with that interesting time period in Gillette. She was our Gillette biologist till 2011 until she moved to Casper, and she was our district biologist in Casper until just a year or two ago when she moved over to our Nongame Mammal Biologist. So even though she's a proud native of the Badger State, she's going to be talking about Wolverines tonight. So, Heather Obrien.
Thanks, Tim. Well, thank you. Tim, you're not off the hook yet. At least they're all mustelids, so they're all in the same family, and badgers are still my favorite. But thanks, Tim. So like he said, I'm going to talk about some Wolverine surveys that we've been doing, not only in Wyoming, but also across Wolverine range in the lower 48. We've been partnering with a whole bunch of other states to all do similar surveys to get a huge collaborative picture of what Wolverines are doing and how their distribution is changing in the lower 48. But first, I'm going to plug some things, and I can go quick through this because Tim already covered it. So like Tim said, my background is I'm a Wisconsin cheesehead originally. I grew up south of Madison. I went to University of Wisconsin for my undergrad degree, and the first wildlife jobs I got were all bird jobs. I'm a huge bird nerd. The field guide that I still carry in my truck is one that was like my third field guide that I got from my folks when I was 10 years old. I still carry the same field guide. And I thought that birds were going to be the thing that I did. And that's what my first field jobs were with some of the species that you see up here. One of those is a student yesterday asked me what my favorite species is, and it's this guy for sure. I have a midlife crisis tattoo of it on my arm now. And then after that, I took 3 or 4 years off and worked in the tech industry and realized that it pays good, but I didn't like it. My passion was with wildlife. So I went back to grad school after a brief break and worked on white-tailed deer and looked at deer densities and ways to non-invasively determine their density on the landscape, and then looked at the effects of high densities of deer on some rare plants on a state natural area. just north of Milwaukee. So did that and kind of broke into like out of birds and into big game, and that gave me the ability to come here after working in a number of places over about a decade in the state of Wisconsin. I came here, like Tim said, to Gillette, and I was fortunate to have Tim as one of my main mentors as I learned how to be a district wildlife biologist. So that includes a lot of big game work, a lot of trophy game, which is like bears, mountain lions, things like that, lots of survey work, sage grouse work. Like Tim said, I moved into that country at the height of coal bed methane development. So a lot of conflict resolution and talking to different agencies and members of the public, and got a whole suite of new skills working both in Gillette and then in Casper on big game species, and essentially any species that has a license and a hunting season associated with it. But during that time, I still would collaborate with our non-game section, which is a very small section that works statewide, and would take the opportunity when those surveys were happening in my districts to participate in those, and still liked all of those less exciting or less dynamic species sometimes are at least harder to see species. So 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to transfer to that section, and I'm now going to plug it really hard to you guys. So the non-game section consists of a supervisor and then 2 permanent biologists, myself and a bird biologist that both work statewide. And then we have a whole suite of contract and technician biologists that work under us in various numbers depending on what projects we have going on from year to year. So we pay attention to these species along with big game species because it's written into state statute that we don't just manage game species. Our agency is, I'm not sure what happened there. Help, Scott. Oh, back on? I have no idea. I'm done, thank you. So every state wildlife agency is responsible for both game species and non-game species. Non-game species are more likely to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. We have quite a few rare species in the state that we work with federal agencies and academia and other entities to try to understand more about and to recover or manage them and maintain them in the state and outside the state. So they can also be indicators of healthy ecosystems. So we can use them sort of as a canary in the coal mine to represent basically be an umbrella species for ecosystem health. And they represent, of course, a tremendous diversity and wildlife heritage in our state. So we do consider all of those species to be important, big or small. Like I said, our section has statewide responsibility. So on the mammal side, we have 83 different non-game species in the state. Obviously, one mammal biologist working statewide and a few people underneath me can't study all of those at the same time or monitor all of those at the same time. So we tend to focus on threatened and endangered species. And the way that we keep track of those is by conducting inventories and maintaining like a database and trends of their distribution and evaluating those over time. Are those trends going up? Are they going down? What are the components or the elements that might be influencing those changes, and what can we do or what should we do, if anything, to influence those trends? And then we can use those to evaluate habitat quality, habitat health, and identify potential threats to those species populations. And then the way that we address, if we identify a threat or something going on that we need to address, we have recovery plans, usually for threatened and endangered species. That involves documents that we collaborate on with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies. So it's a lot of multi-agency collaboration in the non-game section with a lot of both federal entities, so Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM, USGS, and then a number of other entities, academia, NGOs, and other people that are interested in specific species. And we do a lot of partnering with the university, both in Wyoming and outside of Wyoming, on research and partner with them to have them do some of the work that maybe we don't have the capacity to do, but we can collaborate with them and inform that, kind of steer that research so that it answers some of the questions that our agency needs answered. So this is just a short list of the current non-game species that we've been focusing on just in the last few years. So the top 3 there are species or groups of species that we have actually on the threatened and endangered list. So black-footed ferret, I'm sure most people know about. Preble's meadow jumping mouse is a little bit less known. It's this little guy down here with the chocolate stripe down his back. We have both of those species in the state. Preble's is a threatened species. Black-footed ferret has a weird designation in Wyoming where it's considered an experimental population, but outside of that, it's an endangered species that obviously we spend a lot of time and effort on. Those, along with a few bat species, we study annually every single year. So we have a dedicated ferret biologist and we have a dedicated bat biologist. And then these other species down here are ones that we've kind of cycled through. Again, we can't study all 83 species at the same time. So from one year to the next, we kind of spend our time and focus and dollars and budget on like the species du jour for that year. So a couple of years ago, we finished up some survey work on pikas in the state. We're currently working on swift fox in the state, doing statewide occupancy surveys for that species right now, and collaborating on a couple of other projects with a couple of other entities. And then of course, Wolverines are what we're gonna talk about today. We just completed a second round of surveys and the rest of this talk will be describing their biology to you, the survey methodology that we use to collect information on their status in the state and beyond, and then some of the results that we've got so far. That being said, this is the species that we're talking about today. And by the way, if you have questions at any point, you can feel free to ask, except Tim. Tim's not allowed. I told him not to bring any tomatoes with him, but we'll see if he listened to me. So again, we're going to talk about life history and ecology, the survey methods that we use for the species and why, and then some of the results that we've gotten so far. So a little bit of life history on Wolverines. I think people think that they're actually bigger than they are. So this is a male here. This is about as big as they get. Females are much smaller, but they are the largest mustelid or weasel family member in North America anyways. There is a species of otter in South America that can be about the same size. But in North America, they're the largest mustelid. Males are larger than females, and they have big feet. They have semi-retractable claws, which gives them the ability to climb trees fairly well. Not perfectly, but pretty good. They have powerful jaws. They're a carrion eater, so that kind of is an adaptation for ripping apart carrion. And they typically have this chocolate coat with lighter markings. The blonde kind of belt that they have around their sides gets called an apron or a skirt by a lot of people. And then they sometimes have some unique markings on their chest, on their feet, and you'll see some examples in some of the photos that come up where you can actually tell some individuals apart by their unique markings. So the distribution of Wolverines is not just in the continental US, they have a circumpolar distribution. So the map on the left is looking down from the North Pole. So we have them in all of these sort of boreal habitats around the North Pole and spreading downward. There's actually a lot of research that's been done on Wolverines in Scandinavian countries, and then quite a bit in Canada as well. And we have some partners in Canada that work with us on this project. Historically, their distribution came down almost to New Mexico and Arizona, and then they were pushed back and extirpated and almost entirely eliminated from the continental US by the mid-20s. By the 1930s, and actually more so in the 60s and onward, they began slowly recolonizing back down into the continental US. So the species is mostly solitary and nocturnal, which makes it difficult to see them and understand how many we have, what their distribution is, because their home range sizes are quite big. And they're just hard to spot just because of their life history and their behavior. Their home range size, females have smaller home ranges than males, so that's why the range you see up there is quite expansive. So home range sizes from 20 square miles to 150 square miles, and that on the large end would be a male's home range size. They prefer these boreal and alpine forest habitats and higher elevations, especially in the summer months. They will basically migrate up in elevation, and then in the wintertime when there's more snow cover, they'll tend to come down in elevation, and it tends to be when we get the most sightings of wolverines from members of the public reported, because you get more opportunity for overlap of where people are on the landscape and where those wolverines are coming down to find food in the winter months. But they do require large areas with low to no disturbance. And some of our recent data has actually shown that that relationship on sort of a landscape scale, and is going to require some more investigation at higher detail to see if there is truly an interaction there between human presence and human disturbance, and whether or not wolverines will use the landscape. But it is one thing that is of concern for this species.
So disturbance could just be human presence?
Yeah, yes. So one of the main things that we've been starting to pay attention to is recreational use in alpine areas. So ski resorts and just like increased use of backcountry, especially for winter snow activities, whether it's skiing, like teleskiing, or like helicoptering in, like that kind of remote activity seems to be on the rise. And there seems to be a correlation with where those things happen and a lack of wolverine presence. It's hard to tease out right now though, because that also the areas of the Rockies essentially and the Cascades where there's those higher levels of human presence for recreation is also on the southern edge of their reestablishing into the, like, as they spread back down through the Rockies. So it could be a combination of those two things. Like they just need some more time to seep into those southern portions of mountain ranges, but it just coincidentally happens to be where we have more winter recreational activity in Colorado and Utah, where there's just a lot more access to those higher elevations all year round. Good question, thank you. Okay, so a little bit more on Wolverine ecology. So they're an opportunistic kind of a carnivore / mesocarnivore. So they'll essentially eat anything. Their scientific name is alludes to the word glutton. So they've had this reputation of just eating everything. Think of like Tasmanian devil kind of behavior. They'll eat anything from berries and seeds and nuts all the way up to large game species. They're not very good at hunting themselves. They eat a lot of carrion. So especially in the winter months, they take advantage of winter mortality of big game quite a bit. So you can imagine like this last winter, which we had quite a severe winter, they would have had lots of diet opportunity. So lots to eat, lots to cache, and they will cache their food in the snow and like not eat it all in one sitting. They also have their young over the winter time. So you'll see these forays of the female away from her den site, where she has several different caches of food. She'll go out and eat that and then return to the den. But they frequently scavenge on carrion whenever they have the opportunity. They have the ability to ambush larger prey, but in the winter months, there's not a lot of opportunity for them to come into contact with a lot of prey items because they do have the ability to stay in deep snow with those big feet. A lot of big game species are going to vacate that deep snow because they can't move around in it. But they can take advantage of small mammals and things like that in the wintertime as well. So their mating season is May to August. They have what's called delayed ovulation and implantation, which is just fancy speak for they will mate and the female will not ovulate until that actual act of mating occurs. That actually incites her to ovulate. And then that fertilized egg will sit there in the female and have delayed implantation. So it won't implant and start to grow into a kit until later on. So the densities that females use tend to be above 7,000 feet. Again, you'll see like on the slides that I keep making notes in blue of snow. And that's another concern that we have with this species relative to climate change. So their need for persistent snow, for denning, and for winter habitat is something that we're monitoring along with adjacent states to see if changes in climate and snowpack are going to affect the distribution of this species because it has such a link to persistent snow. But other than denning and snow, they will den under logs and boulders as well. So kits are born in February to March. They tend to have 1 to 4 kits. 2 is pretty typical. And those kits stay in the den until about May. Again, that's kind of associated with snowmelt at those elevations. And then they're dependent on the female for at least another year. And they don't reach maturity to mate themselves until they are 2 or 3 years old. So all of that boils down to this is a species that has a very slow reproductive rate. They don't replace themselves very quickly compared to some other species. So when their numbers go down, it takes a long time for those numbers to come back up just because their reproductive rate is quite slow. Some population level threats, both past and present. The ones in white are kind of from the past and hopefully for the most part gone now. And the ones in yellow are kind of our more recent and modern day concerns for the species. So they were persecuted in earlier years as being a threat to livestock. Their fur is actually valuable or was valuable. You can still trap them in some states and in some provinces, but they're obviously a protected species right now in Wyoming. But habitat loss via logging, again, think of things at the elevation that the species exists and those things that eat up or fragment their habitat. So logging, wildfire, roads, housing developments, things like that happening at higher elevations are considered a population threat for the species. Any of those things creates fragmented habitat like we mentioned before. They like a lot of space with a lot of solitude and not a lot of disturbance. So anything that cuts that down is of concern. Again, we talked about winter recreation being an issue that we're monitoring as well as climate change. So their management status, so they were petitioned to be listed as a threatened or endangered species under the Endangered Species Act in 1994 and in 2000. Those listings were found not warranted due to lack of data, which is why we're doing what we're doing. We're trying to fill those gaps in with good information now. But during those 2 time periods, the Fish and Wildlife Service found it not warranted to list the species under the Endangered Species Act because we just didn't have enough information on them. Currently, they're under review for threatened status, which is why we're conducting these ongoing surveys to find out where they are. Again, they exist at low density on the landscape and they're difficult to detect. So we need to figure out how can we how can we design a survey on a range-wide scale where we can collect some information that's useful in helping make these determinations for endangered species status. And so we identified this need for better data for that in turn will allow us to manage the species better and make good conservation decisions. So with all that said, a bunch of state agencies formed a cooperative group to monitor wolverines across multiple states. The goal was to promote long-term population viability and support expansion where possible into suitable habitat. Again, we have places where we've identified all of the things that we know that wolverine prefer on the landscape for their habitat. But we don't find them there yet. Basically, they either haven't spread down into those places yet, or they just have been cut off from them in some way or another. So one of the goals of this group is to support the expansion of the species into suitable habitat. And in the case of Colorado right now, they're working on getting approval for a translocation project of wolverines from other places in their range and reintroducing them into the state of Colorado in the Rockies. So that's one of the things that our group is investigating, and then managing wolverines, of course, as a protected species, and until the point at which, if it comes, we feel that they're recovered. So the group that I sit on and represent for Wyoming Game and Fish is this Western States Wolverine Conservation Project. It's part of what's called WAFWA, which is the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. It's basically has representatives from every state in the Western US. And then there's a nationwide one called OFWA for the entire US. So multiple states from the West kind of use WAFWA as the like the umbrella agency group to help us gather funding, kind of get organized, and to report our results to. That, along with all of these other entities and more, I'm sure I forgot some, but you can see a number of state agencies on there, ourselves, California, Utah, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Washington. I think that's everybody. And then we also have members on the group from some federal agencies, the Forest Service, the Park Service, and then also some other entities. So the National Genomic Center does our genetics work and analysis. There's a company out of Montana called SpeedGoat that helps us do our statistical data analysis. And then the Woodland Park Zoo has been really elemental. They're based out of Washington, and they've designed some of the equipment that we use in the field and field tested it. And we couldn't do this without them. And then also several tribal entities, the Kootenai, and then the Wind River tribes as well here in Wyoming have facilitated this work as well. So we know we have a problem. We have like these data gaps, and we would like to get that information so we can make more informed decisions along with the Fish and Wildlife Service to determine what the status should be of this species. So the solution we came up with for a species that's low density and hard to find on the landscape are camera trap surveys. So everybody and their brother's uncle now has security cameras and trail cameras. They've become really, really valuable as a tool for basically like non-invasive survey work, where we don't have to be there in person to see this species on a landscape that's very difficult for us to have the time, the physical ability and the means to get out and see in person. So instead, we can put these cameras out on the landscape, leave them long-term, and then collect them when we have access to that country again and look through images and see what we have. So we designed this survey across multiple states. Everyone's apples to apples using the exact same methodology. And then we can get a range-wide result of presence or absence of this species on the landscape and document where they are. And then we repeat this every 5 years. Doing this annually is probably overkill. It's also a lot of work and effort just to get these cameras in and out of the field. So we do this on a rotating basis, and we've done this survey now on this 5-year annual rotation twice. So we don't have a whole lot of trend data yet, but it's still really, really cool stuff and really interesting. So the way these occupancy surveys work is you create a grid of squares that are based on what you believe the home range size is of this species. Again, you remember the huge range. It was like 20 square miles to almost 160 square miles. We're going to use the small end for the females, and that's going to be our grid cell size. And then you can't put a camera in every single one of those across all of their suitable habitat, because that's just that's too much workload and too much equipment. So we take a random sample of those grid cells in that suitable habitat, and then we utilize these trail cameras along with lure or bait to basically entice that species to come and have its picture taken. And we can leave those out, like I said, over the entire winter. And in some cases, we go and check them if they're accessible. In other ones, we leave them out the entire winter, wait for snow melt, and then go back to those sites and retrieve those cameras and see who we have pictures of. And then just for added flair, since we're putting the effort in, we also added to that a way to collect hair for DNA analysis. And we literally, this is a lot of wildlife work involves like making things up using cheap equipment. So we use gun brushes, which you would use to clean your rifle out, which are like have metal bristles on them, and make a whole belt that goes a lot like around the base of the tree with these gun brushes sticking out. So that is underneath the bait that's further up the tree. When that wolverine climbs up the tree to try to get at that food item, they rub up against those gun brushes and leave a hair sample. Cheap and easy, and then you hope for the best. And you get all kinds of other weird hair samples on there as well. Whoops, let's go back. Okay, so again, these cameras were placed out in the fall at each of the randomly selected survey sites. And then collected in the spring. Like I said, some of those cameras were accessible, I should say. We have some really tough, really great technicians that worked on this project that I'll give credit to later on that dealt with some crazy environmental conditions. But some of them are what we call accessible sites. And those sites we actually put bait out. So a piece of a deer leg. Other states would use like a beaver carcass, just something meaty and something that's food. So the camera sites that are so far back in backcountry that we have to leave them the entire winter, we have lure that comes out of a dispenser. I mentioned the Woodland Park Zoo. They designed a dispenser that drips lure almost like a blade, like a Glade plug-in, like on a periodic cycle. It dispenses some stinky lure onto a bone, basically a beef bone that you have tied underneath that dispenser. And that gives off a scent that attracts wolverines and other species to come get their picture taken. And again, we can leave that out all winter and not have to go check it. So the camera images that we collected, the hair samples that we collected then get analyzed. The hair samples get ID'd to either species or to individual, depending on the quality of the hair sample. And all of that information gets used in our results and gets shared with those adjacent states and gets shared with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so that we have all of that information that we're looking for to fill those gaps in to know more about this species and its status. So what does all that, excuse me, look like? I'm going to lose my voice. I told you, Scott. So this is one of our trees. The lines here are just from our instruction book to show the technicians when they're setting the camera up, kind of how to have it set up so that you can see the base of this survey tree. So we used everybody on this project used the exact same cameras. Like I said, everything's apples to apples. Gun brushes, like I said, they went on these collars that are wrapped around the base of the tree below where the bait is. This is a deer leg. And this site actually has also a sponge with some of that smelly lure on it. We did this setup initially in 2016 and 17. And then last year, we realized that this is overkill because we're coming in every month or so and replacing this. So that is what the baited sites look like. The lure sites, again, I told you there's a piece of bone, and then we have a dispenser here that has basically a bladder, almost like the ones that you get in your backpack to drink out of, that's full of lure, and it has some electronics in it that dispense that lure in a certain amount, and it drips onto that bone so that can kind of hold on to that lure scent. This is just another picture of bait. This is a beaver carcass used in a different state. But we have access to lots of roadkill deer. So we use deer legs for deer quarters for our project. So we put those out, we leave the cameras alone. At the baited sites, we'll swap the camera cards out while we're there and collect that data to analyze over the winter. But this is what some of the camera images look like from our cameras. Again, you can see that's the gun brush belt and the baits up here. We'll see this site again a little bit later. You can also see some of the unique markings of different individuals. This guy has a completely white foot that makes him pretty easy to spot on multiple cameras. So that individual showed up at more than one of our camera sites, presumably a male with a very big home range. And you can see this one also has some white markings on his foot and some unique chest markings. It's almost, like fingerprinting. Sometimes we don't get a very good look though at that chest marking to be able to tell one individual from the other. And you will see like some of them are darker and have lighter apron or skirting. This one's got quite a bit blonder, but some of that's kind of the lighting depending on the time of day that the picture was taken. A lot of our images, because this is mostly a nocturnal species, are nighttime pictures, therefore they're black and white, so they're a little bit more difficult to discern all of those little tiny minute markings. So this is the first year of results. I don't know if anyone here was present when my predecessor, Nicole Bjornley, presented this data, but we'll add to it in this presentation, so hopefully you don't get too bored. So this shows results across the original 4 states that participated in the first year of the study. So ourselves, Montana, Idaho, and Washington were participants in that first year. And then Oregon, Utah, and Colorado and California were added on this more recent round. So our results were in Wyoming, we got 6 cameras out of 51 in Wyoming. That gives us a detection, an occupancy rate of just over 10%. We ended up with, comparatively to the other places within their range across the West, we were kind of on the low end of occupancy during this time period. And you can see most of our survey sites are in the GYE, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So this is the Wind River Range, Wyoming Range here, and then Yellowstone's up here. These are in the Bighorns. The lighter gray squares just shows you the grids that I was telling you about. The black ones are the ones that were selected to have cameras. And then the dark green ones are ones where we actually got one on the camera. So we consider that a detection. Just because, I just want to reassure you, because I know everyone's gonna take it personally. That none were found in the Bighorns does not mean that they're not here. You can see, we have a subsample of the Bighorns, and the fact that nobody walked in front of a camera in the Bighorns does not mean they're not here. And I will supplement that with saying we have confirmed sightings in the Bighorns that are incidental. They're not part of the survey, but members of the public or some of our colleagues have seen them, and they're confirmed. It's I keep a database of all of our incidental observations, and we require a confirmed track or a photo or a video or something like that, because we do get lots of mix-ups with like young black bears or pine martens and other species that look similar. So I'll record anybody's incident in that database, but in order for it to be a confirmed observation, I need evidence. So they have very distinct tracks. And obviously if there's picture or video, we can tell who that is. But not to discourage you that there is no detections from our cameras. But we did get detections, including this one down here, which I'll get to in the next slide. But the highest area of occupancy in that initial year was kind of in the central shared Idaho, Montana, northern continental divide portion of their range. But we did get, this is the Cascade Mountains up here. Washington does a ton of work with fur bearers, with mustelids. It's a big part of their agency, more so than it is a part of ours. So they do quite a bit of work, not just with wolverines, but with fishers and marten as well. So they jumped on board in the Cascades and they did pretty well with their occupancy up in that country as well. Woo, this thing just wants to fire through, sorry. Oh my, I apologize. There we go, that's what I wanted. So this down here is the lowest in the southernmost detection of a female wolverine in the continental US, at least during that time period. Since then, Utah last year caught and moved a nuisance wolverine that was getting into someone's sheep. So obviously we've got actual wolverines down in Utah and Colorado. We did at one time in the mid 2000s have some collared wolverines, and there were some in the lower part of Wyoming and like in the Madres and down into Colorado, but they did not stick around there, at least not that collared individual, and dispersed out of there after spending some time there. But officially in the literature, that is the southernmost female wolverine confirmed from DNA in the lower 48 to date. Oh, come on. Okay, so that was 2016, 2017 data. So our more recent data, like I said, we added some states to the mix. So we got Oregon, California, Utah, and Colorado decided that they wanted to play. So again, you can see this expansion of suitable habitat with grid cells overlaid onto it. So we have all of this stuff down here that that qualifies, has all of the qualifications as far as we know of what is suitable wolverine habitat. Colorado wasn't able to like focus their personnel to cover more sampling down here, which is why you see just the blue are the ones that are sampled in the northern part of the state. And then Utah's sample California's and Oregon's. So we added those survey sites along with the original 4 states again in 2021 and 22, and then same thing, apples to apples, we did the same survey style. In the original 4 states, it was even the same sampling. We used the exact same sites over again. So we did everything all over again, and the results were a little bit different this time around. Not to say that it was bad or good, just changed. So occupancy in Washington and the Cascades declined compared to the previous survey. Also declined in that central area that we were talking about between Idaho and Montana. But the good news for us anyways is that occupancy of wolverines increased both in central Idaho and in the GYE in Wyoming. So we had better success. We had more wolverines on more cameras in Wyoming during this survey than the first one. But overall, if you look at the big picture, you have them declining in some areas and increasing in others. And if you analyze it all together, it comes out in the wash. And we didn't have a significant change range-wide in their occupancy status across their whole range. But if you pick it apart by the imaginary lines that we draw state boundaries on, we did see an increase in Wyoming. So if you zoom in to our state, like I said, we had 13 instead of so the first round we had 6 detections or 6 cameras that had wolverines on them. This last round we had 13 out of 49. That gives us, remember that was 0.12 was our occupancy in 2016-17. This time around in 21 and 22, we had an occupancy rate of 0.27. We also had detections at 9 new sites. And we went through, I shouldn't say only 4,975 images. Those are just the ones that had Wolverines on them. So the cameras take multiple pictures as they go of the same individual over and over again if it stays at the site for a while. But we had almost 5,000 Wolverine images along with a whole bunch of other things on cameras. All things said, I want to say it was like 200,000 images to sort through. So there's a lot of work where your brain starts to melt looking through lots of images, which is in the off time, those super tough technicians that were out in those winter landscapes then got to come and be warm and toasty and look at tons and tons and tons of pictures. So lots of magpies, lots of Clark's nutcrackers that are trying to get at that bait and having their pictures taken over and over again. Again, this year, sorry, again, still no detections in the bighorn. So I'm sorry if it's hard to see the difference on here, but the bright pink dots are where we had Wolverines show up on the cameras, and then the darker ones. So we added 3 cameras down here in the Snowy Range, and then we had the same sites again up here in the bighorns and the same ones in the GYE and Wyoming Range and Wind River Range. So still no detections in the bighorns, I'm sorry. And we didn't get any detections in the Snowy Range or Sierra Madres. Again, though, we've had confirmed observations, like incidental observations in those places, just none on our cameras during our occupancy surveys. So we know they use that habitat. We just don't know if they're moving through or if they're staying put, and those are home ranges for them. This adds some of those incidental observations or confirmed observations on there. So again, I apologize, this is hard to, it's not showing up very well, but we have some blue dots here. And these are from members of the public. Again, it seems like it's been increasing over time, the number of reports that we get. And it's that chicken or egg scenario though. So is that increase in people seeing and reporting Wolverines because we have more people in their habitat, we have more eyes on the ground, or is it because we have increasing numbers of Wolverines on the landscape? And it's probably a combination of those two things, but we certainly see a lot more people doing backcountry and winter recreating, especially after COVID. We've got a lot more people that are active on the landscape. So, this map adds those incidental sightings from the public that were confirmed, and then all of our camera detections. All of that stuff, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asks states for that information to compile in their decision-making process, all of that stuff now we can provide to them and fill in those data gaps. So it's really useful stuff. Even all of the calls that we get just from recreators, from just nature lovers, like people out on walks. We get quite a few people that accidentally run into a Wolverine and get pretty excited about it. And it's really great if we can confirm it and add it to our information. So those gun brushes and the DNA that we collected, the only useful DNA that we could get are from the sites that our technicians could access over the winter. So they're the sites that had bait. Those hairs, if they stay out there all winter long on those gun brushes, they degrade, they dry out, and the genetics lab can't do anything with them. Even some of these hair samples, they can be, some of them are good enough quality that they can be identified to species, but they're not good enough to analyze down to individual and let you know what sex they are. But we'll take whatever information we can get. It just kind of depends on the quality and like how much hair follicle is left and how long it was left out in the cold. So in that first initial survey, we collected and were able to get 19, well, we collected more samples than that, but 19 hair samples were able to be identified down to species as Wolverine. And then 4 of those samples were able to be analyzed to individuals. So we ended up with 2 of them being male, 2 being female. And that's how we knew that that point down in the south end of the winds was a female and could report that and publish that and share with the scientific community. So still worth the effort. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot more than you're already lugging a deer quarter in there. Bringing envelopes in, collecting hair is just an extra little thing to do. And the genetic data is really useful. Not only do we just use it for this, and then we can cross-reference that with some of the photos at some of those sites to see if we can match it with the individual that it was collected from. We share all of this DNA information, and Idaho did the same thing with an academic guy. His name's Mike Schwartz. He's a really brilliant guy. He does genetic work mainly in Canada, looking at barriers to genetic to Wolverine dispersal, and you can see it in genetic variation. So Highway 2 that runs across the bottom of Canada, like Banff is to the north and Calgary is to the north of that. That is a barrier to movement, and you can look at the genome of this of the Wolverines to the north of that highway and the ones to the south, and see like a genetic difference between the two. So it gives us. We share that hair information and the DNA results from that with him and a greater group of researchers, and then they're going to utilize that to look at if we have some genetic issues with some of these dispersers. Are they like, do we need to capture and transfer Wolverines from other places to bolster the genetics so that we don't end up with sort of degraded genomes in our populations down here? Yes or no? So that information is being analyzed right now, but the work that he and his colleagues do is really, really cool. And this just helps add to the pile of information that he has to work with. So for 21 and 22, this last survey, we did a lot better. And basically we get better and better at this the more we do these surveys. So we were able to get 39 hair samples identified down to species as Wolverine. Again, we get other hair samples in there like fishers and not fishers here, but pine martens here, grizzly bears, other things climb up those trees and leave hair samples as well. And we get some deer hair from the bait that gets stuck in there and mistaken for Wolverine hair until we get it analyzed. But 39 samples ID'd as Wolverine. 22 of those samples we were able to look at and analyze to individual genotypes. So, and then from that, we got 10 unique individuals. So some of those 22 were repeats essentially. So the same animal like at multiple sites again. So we had 10 unique individuals this time, 6 females and 4 males. And again, some sites had multiple individuals, like hairs collected at one camera trap site of more than one Wolverine, and some individuals left hair at more than one site, so they're getting around to more than one camera trap. I don't know how to make this go from my. So this is a bunch of the camera images at a very popular site, strung together. So you can see some of the images that we get. And a magpie tagging along, looking for free snacks. You can see this individual's got a white foot that makes him easy to tell from others. You can see the date and time stamp here. And he keeps going up. This is that gun brush collar. He's leaving hair samples every time he jumps up there, hopefully. And that's what's left of the bait. Everyone else has had a turn and pretty much cleaned it out. But this is the information that the camera gives us. All of this is just like one positive, like that survey site obviously has a Wolverine. In fact, it has 2 Wolverines. This one doesn't have that white foot. So that's a second individual. It's a little bit smaller if you compare. Yeah, rolling around, you can see you're in here. So he's rolling around in that. Got like some like Mission Impossible moves going on. I love at one point it gets the first one gets frustrated and like chases the magpie around. This is a third individual that has these white marks on its back. So 3 different Wolverines visiting in like the course of a couple of hours. Presumably, the last two are kind of smaller. It's either a female with a subadult still dependent on her, or it's two subadults that are wandering around together is my guess. This camera site is one that we got 2 hair samples confirmed down to gender. So there's 1 male and 1 female. And then some of the other hair samples were 2 mixed. So we weren't able to discern all 3 of those individuals, but we got 2 at least. So 1 male, 1 female. We do get other visitors, like I said, at the site, so it does make it kind of exciting to go through all of those thousands and thousands of images. So there's a red fox in that first picture carrying a snowshoe hare. We have different bear species climbing up the tree. This one is a black bear who's very adept at climbing the tree. We have grizzly bears that try to climb the trees and get frustrated and take it out on their neighbors, and it's kind of entertaining to watch, like yearling grizzlies like fight over and squabble with each other on the camera images. We have pine marten here. We had lots of instances of pine marten on the camera. Everything from bobcats to mountain lions. We get moose that come and inspect things, and elk that are curious and sniff around, everything under the sun. We don't discount and throw that data out. We take all of that. We have obviously a location of that camera. So all of those incidences go into our big statewide database and help bolster our observations across the state of multiple other species. There's some grizzly bears, these 2. I should make like a video similar to that one that you just watched, because these 2 get in a big fight with each other. At least they can get up the tree. Mom cannot climb the tree. She's way too big. But wolves, this one's got a collar on it. So that's information that we then share with the folks doing wolf research, that we caught their wolf on our camera, just give them a little bit of information. And these are those tough as nails tags. These guys are ridiculous, like made out of like leather and steel. We have Houston, Owen, Colin, and Autumn. These guys busted their butts for a whole winter, skiing, snowshoeing, getting stuck, just dealing with all kinds of elements, going into bear country repeatedly. So this work couldn't be done without technicians that are willing and physically capable of doing all this hard work for us. There's no way I could keep up with them. Absolutely not. They're super. But so all of that information, like I said, we use that to cover kind of these main goals and conclusions. So these changes, like I said, in Wolverine occupancy can be monitored over time every time we conduct the survey. And every time we do it all in concert with our partners. So it's all in the same year, all at the same time. It's a big, coordinated, collaborative effort. It's actually a really fun group. Sometimes groups like that can be a little intimidating or frustrating depending on different personalities. I love this group of biologists from across the West. They're all really great people. So a pleasure to work with and coordinate with. But it gives us that Western-wide image of what the species is doing. So those additional survey years that we add to these 2, it's kind of hard to get a trend from just 2 years of data. But as we add to those every 5 years, it's going to start showing us trends, and it's going to be a worthwhile effort to use that both locally to make management decisions and region-wide. So those survey results, again, like I have mentioned multiple times, will direct the future research questions that we have about this species. It'll be information that's shared to fill those knowledge gaps, both for us and for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And ultimately, it's going to give us the best our best ability to make the most informed decisions about whether this species needs to be listed, and then what steps would need to be taken to recover that species and where. Oh, and it's not going to go to my last slide. There we go. That's what I have for you. So if you have any questions, I would really appreciate it. Thank you guys all for coming out on a Wednesday night. It's great to see a big crowd of people. I appreciate you guys coming. Thanks.
You had mentioned Colorado is looking at doing a traffic transfer program to reintroduce.
Yeah.
Is there any data anywhere that shows the success rates of Wolverines being introduced to a new area? Do they adapt well?
So we've been kind of working on coming up with a document to plan all of that out. And the main question that everyone is kind of getting wrapped around the axle over is, do we introduce, like, capture and move Wolverines from this southern portion where they're dispersing from, where it's similar latitudes, where presumably the ones that we have here in Wyoming would be similarly adapted to latitudes in, just a little bit further south. The hang up is that genetically they're kind of isolated. So it may make more sense. Ultimately, I think that the answer that we're going to come to is to get individuals from multiple places with different genomic backgrounds and allow those to intermix, and the good genes are going to float to the top with the survival of if there's reproduction there, hopefully that's going to kind of figure itself out, and we're not going to create like a more truncated genome for the ones that may get introduced into Colorado. There's been some relocation work before from Canada into the lower 48, and I'm gonna forget, I think it was just to Montana. It wasn't, so not very far, and not very drastic of a move. That being said, I from the last discussions that we had, it sounded like it also makes sense not to remove individuals from a low, like a low occupancy area in the grand scheme of things. The Canadian provinces have much higher densities of Wolverine, to the point where it's legal to trap them in some provinces. It probably makes more sense to take individuals from those places where it's not to the detriment of the ones dispersing into new areas. So we'll have to see what decisions get made, but there will be a lot of voices in determining that. And I don't even know when it's going to happen. It was something that was kind of the governor of Colorado's pet project. It's a species that he very much likes, but they're like waist or neck deep in wolf relocation and translocation right now. That took priority. So I don't even know if this will actually follow through, but Colorado is sort of the litmus test, and if that's successful, I know that the agency folks in California in the Sierras are like waiting to see if that works, because they want to be next on board if it does. Yeah. More questions? Mr. Bradshaw.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
So, is there a sense from like old trapping records or other historical accounts that give you some idea about the relative density between, early 1800s, mid 1800s, and now in Wyoming?
Yeah, I don't know in Wyoming if there's anything extensive enough to draw any conclusions. I would say Montana's probably the one with the highest likelihood of good trapping records, just because they've had a fairly decent density of Wolverines in the area for a while. The one thing that we do pay attention to in modern years is accidental take, which happens kind of, not very frequently, but every now and then someone who's trapping pine marten or something accidentally gets a Wolverine, and we try to get as much information as possible from those individuals, obviously, or at least like if it's dead, to get it, get the carcass in hand, get genetic information, get health information, and all of that stuff. But historically speaking, I don't know that records were kept well enough, at least not in Wyoming, to glean anything. Canada's got a lot of information, and there's been a lot of research since the 60s that's mainly been done in Canada. So we do have, I should add in that slide that has all the partners in it, we just in the last year added some representatives from BC and Alberta, so that they can interact with us. Again, our lines are all imaginary as far as Wolverines are concerned. So having them collaborate with us and not have us reinvent the wheel where they've done this stuff in the past or something similar, or can advise us to make good decisions is what we lean on more than anything. Does that get at your question?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yes.
You may have already talked about this, but can you breed wolverines in like captivity?
There are some zoos in Scandinavia that have done so. Again, mustelids, like things in the weasel family, are kind of tricky to breed in captivity. So you can't use artificial insemination because the females don't ovulate until they are actually being bred. So it requires a male, not somebody with, like sterile equipment and gloves. So, and then that delayed implantation makes things interesting too. But there are some zoos in Scandinavia that have reared some in captivity. So it is a possibility. Again, they're just like it's easier to translocate ones from the wild that have the genetics for this side of things than to inherit or request some from those places, just with concerns about the genetics, like the differentiation between those two regions. Even though it's the same species, there are subspecies of those, and we don't want to tinker with that intentionally if we can help it. But it is possible, it's just complicated. And a better example of us trying to figure that out is they're smaller but still sassy cousins, black-footed ferrets. We have a breeding center in Colorado, and it is very complicated, and all that stuff was figured out here in Wyoming when they were rediscovered in the late 80s and early 90s. But that breeding program had it was a big learning curve figuring out how to breed them in captivity. So there's not a lot of zoo type situations where we have that opportunity with wolverines. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, it seems like the winter is a really hard time to run a survey. Do you do it then because of the way they behave in the winter versus other species, or what sort of?
Yes, so it's a couple of things. First off, putting bait out in the summertime or in the months when bears are not hibernating is a dangerous undertaking. And we put the public at risk by putting those sites out too on public land where anybody could be out doing whatever they want to, and they should, use public lands that way. It eliminates the bear option by a lot. And in the winter months where you get that snowpack, you only have a few species that are out and awake and moving around on the landscape that are going to get their picture taken during that time period. And it includes this species. It's also when their mating period is. So we try to encapsulate the time period when mating's occurring because there's more movement of individuals. So again, if they're moving around on the landscape more, they're more likely to come into contact with the bait or lure and come and get their picture taken. And we're doing the same thing right now with our Swiftfox surveys. So those are taking place right now, which coincides with when juveniles are dispersing away from their natal dens. So you have this burst of movement and a higher likelihood of catching individuals on a camera. So yeah, it takes advantage of their life history, but also it's a safety concern as well. Yeah. And a rotten deer leg hanging in a tree in the summertime. Not so fun either. So yeah, but they can move around so well in that snowpack compared to other species. We can put these in remote sites and not have to sort through a million pictures of everything else that is awake and coming into that bait. Yeah. Yes.
Is there enough evidence of significant genomic diversity in the Canadian Wolverines versus the American Wolverines?
There is.
That there
Yeah.
wouldn't be bottlenecking happening?
Yeah, and I'm gonna slaughter it because I'm not a geneticist, but Mike's research that he's shown our group of like multi-agency folks. I've seen him give that presentation twice, and again that highway too across the southern part of Canada, you can genetically see that it's a movement barrier for this species. There's occasionally one that makes it across, and it doesn't take very many individuals making it to that other population to to make the genetic diversity kind of like jump up and flourish a little bit more again. But you get to these southern outlier areas, including Wyoming, and the genetic diversity drops and is significantly different from where you have a lot more contiguous habitat and a little bit denser population of wolverines, so that you have more interbreeding. Yeah.
Carry up that question.
Yeah.
Are there man-made structures like roads or other things in Wyoming that you think are keeping that population from spreading farther south from what you've found so far, or is that not considered to be a factor?
You know, the I-80 corridor is the only thing I could think of that maybe stands between the GYE and like the other parts of the Rockies. But that being said, my mention of the one Wolverine that was caught in Utah. My Utah colleague put a collar on her when they caught her. And then they took her from the Uintas up and around to sort of the, is it the Bear Creek Range? Or it's like, as you come around the corner of Utah, like south of Idaho, stuck her over there. She did come back into Wyoming, like a bunch of her locations were there. The fun part is like they didn't have a Wolverine specific collar on hand. They're kind of tube shaped. So keeping a collar on one of them that's not a specialized collar meant to fit a Wolverine. They had a mountain lion collar, and it was like, well, why don't we have her in hand? Why let's put this collar on her. She like got the collar off after a couple of weeks, but we got location data on her in the meantime, and she went right back like long distance over. It did not need to be like suitable habitat. She went on a walkabout straight back to the Wasatches. So, but I mean, she kind of hung around in Wyoming for a little while before she made her way there, and then she slipped the collar. So, yeah.
Wasn't there one years ago that went from Colorado up to North Dakota?
Yeah. That's like an attestament to, and males will do that a lot more than females, but yeah, it was harvested in North Dakota. They will cover, and that's why I don't ever discount someone's report of a Wolverine in like not Wolverine habitat. When I worked in Gillette, I had someone that swore that they saw a Wolverine cross in sagebrush out by Spotted Horse. And I didn't feed him any information, and he described their gait. They have a very weird 3-footed sort of running gait, like any mastella, they kind of run funny. He described the coat, like the appearance of it. That's not, without a picture or anything, it's still not a confirmed, but I would not doubt it, and I don't discredit those observations because it happens, obviously, for a Wolverine to get from Colorado and end up in North Dakota. And there's several points along the way where we went out to where that point was to look at the habitat, and it's just like sagebrush and sand and, like somewhere south of Jeffrey City, it's just like, but it was just booking somewhere. So yeah, they can disperse very, very far when they want to. And it only takes one disperser like that to bolster the genetics of wherever it ends up. Any other questions? Yeah, and I hope I didn't slaughter, like, hopefully his head isn't like ringing right now as I slaughter his data and his information. He's a really smart guy, and he's very good at conveying really hard information to ding dongs like me. So it was really fascinating stuff. Any other questions? Thanks again for coming out. I appreciate it, everybody.
Injure yourself or just injure yourself?
Yeah.